Welcome back. For those that were part of last week's free masterclass, thank you for all the great comments and support. Let's look at this week's blog submission, the consistent underwater edit, number 3, exposure. When an underwater photograph looks dark or flat, most photographers instinctively reach for the exposure. That seems logical, but if white balance is still wrong, you may be judging brightness, contrast, and detail through a strong blue or green color cast. In the consistent underwater edit, that is why exposure comes second, not first. White balance gives us more reliable image to judge. Then exposure can do its job, build the tonal foundation. In this video, I'll show you why that order matters and how it helps you avoid unnecessary rework. Let's start by looking at where exposure fits in the 6-step system. The consistent underwater edit follows a specific order: white balance, exposure, presence, color, masking, and final adjustments. In this lesson, we are focused on step 2, exposure. That matters because each step has one job. White balance is not there to fix exposure. Its job is to correct the strongest color cast and give us a more reliable image to judge. Then exposure can do its job. It builds the tonal foundation. It helps us decide overall brightness, protect important highlights, recover useful shadow detail, and create a usable tonal range that the rest of the edit can follow. When you keep the steps separate, the workflow becomes easier to repeat, and you spend less time going back to fix decisions you already made. Now let's look at why white balance has to come first before we make those exposure decisions. White balance does not change how much light your camera captured. That exposure is already recorded in the file. But white balance does change how Lightroom renders the color in the image. And that changes what your eyes are judging. Underwater, a strong blue or green cast can make your subject look darker, flatter, and lower in contrast than it really is. The subject may not separate well from the water. Important detail may be there, but it is harder to judge accurately because the color foundation is still wrong. That is why exposure becomes more dependable after white balance. We are not changing the captured exposure first. We are correcting the color foundation so we can make better tonal decisions. Now that the image is more reliable to judge, let's talk about what the exposure step is really supposed to do. Once white balance is established, we can make a more reliable exposure decision. But exposure is not simply about making the photograph brighter or darker. At this stage, I am looking at the entire tonal structure of the image. I want to protect the important highlights, open useful shadow detail, establish the whites and blacks, and make sure the midtones give the subject enough separation. What I am not trying to do yet is create the final dramatic look. The job of exposure is to give us a strong, usable tonal foundation so the adjustments that come later have something solid to build upon. Now let me give you a simple way to decide when that exposure foundation is actually good enough. Here is a simple way to decide whether your exposure foundation is ready. First, look at the entire photograph. Is it generally too bright or too dark? Second, check the highlights. Are the important bright areas protected? Third, look into the shadows. Is there useful detail there, or are important areas becoming blocked up? Fourth, look at the midtones. Does the subject have enough brightness and separation to read naturally? And finally, step back and look at the whole photograph again. Does it feel balanced? You're not trying to finish the image at this point. You're simply deciding whether the tonal foundation is strong enough to support the next steps. Once it is, move on. That brings us to an important stopping point in the workflow. At this point in the workflow, stop and look at the photograph as a whole. If the overall tonal foundation feels balanced, you do not need to keep pushing the exposure controls. This is where many underwater photographers create problems. They keep adjusting the entire image when only one part of the photograph still needs help. So the next question is simple. Does the problem affect the entire photograph, or does it only affect one specific area? That is where we separate global exposure from local masking. Let's look at the difference next. Once the overall exposure looks right, we need to keep global adjustments and local adjustments in their proper roles. Global exposure affects the entire photograph. Its job is to establish the overall tonal foundation. But suppose the background looks good and the turtle is still too dark. That does not necessarily mean the whole image needs more exposure. Later in the workflow, masking lets us brighten the turtle without brightening everything around it. That distinction becomes especially important underwater because unnecessarily global brightening can make things look like backscatter and distracting background detail more noticeable. So remember, global exposure builds the foundation. Local masking solves local problems. And before we leave the exposure step, there is one more temptation we need to avoid. Once the exposure step looks balanced, it can be tempting to keep pushing the image. You may want more contrast, more texture, deeper looking water, or a stronger dramatic effect. But those decisions belong to the next step. Presence tools like texture, clarity, and dehaze are much easier to judge after the exposure foundation is already set. If the image is still too dark, too bright, or uneven, those tools can exaggerate the problem. So at this point, stop before you begin adding drama. Exposure builds the foundation. Presence strengthens that foundation later. Let's bring this back to the main lesson. The big lesson is simple. Correct white balance first, then use exposure to build the tonal foundation. Do not ask exposure to finish the photograph. Do not ask it to solve every local problem. And do not use it to create the final dramatic look. Its job is to prepare the image for the next decision. When each step has one job, your editing becomes faster, more consistent, and much more easier to repeat. The full article is linked below, and if you are following the Consistent Underwater Edit series, subscribe so you do not miss the next lesson on presence. Dive safe, shoot with a purpose, and edit with confidence.